right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Kuntz, and I have the pleasure of serving as a state archivist for North Carolina. And for those of you looking at your program, you're probably saying, that is not Dr. Kevin Cherry. We don't bear any resemblance to each other. And he was supposed to do the welcome this afternoon, and I apologize. He got called away for an emergency a couple hours ago, so he was unable to be here, but he sends his regards. So on behalf of Dr. Cherry, who serves as our Deputy Secretary in charge of the Office of Archives and History, as well as the administration of DNCR, led by Secretary Susie Hamilton, I want to welcome you to the 2018 annual meeting of the Friends of the Archives. The Friends of the Archives is one of several support groups that actively work to enhance the programming within the Office of Archives and History. And every year, the department benefits from the volunteer hours, literally tens of thousands of volunteer hours donated by citizens to the Office of Archives and History, as well as the financial support for important programs and activities that are run by our agency. Earlier this month, actually, Dr. Cherry had summarized a lot of the activities, the highlights that went on in the last year within the Office of Archives and History, and it's a very impressive list. It got sent out, I know, to the board members of the Friends of the Archives. If you have not seen that in another listserv distribution or other place, please let me know. I'm happy to send it to you, but it really speaks to all the activities and programming that went on within Archives and History this last year. And I would be remiss at the opening if I did not mention a major ongoing project of the Friends of the Archives in this last year, and that was fundraising for some conservation work on some of our biggest treasures, including the Bill of Rights, the 4 pages of the Carolina Charter of 1663, and the Lord's Proprietors Papers. For those of you that have been around Friends programming for a while, that is one really critical role that the Friends plays, is raising money for conservation work on some of our treasures. The goal for this particular project was a little bit over $10,300 to have ongoing conservation work and reframing done for the Bill of Rights and the charter pages, and then some new housing built for the Lord's Proprietor Papers, which are still in their older housing from the 1960s. So to date, we've raised a little over $8,000, so that's enough work for the charter and the Bill of Rights. There's a little more than $2,000 to go. I encourage you to make a contribution if you haven't already, as that will go towards the Lord's Proprietors Papers. So you can see any member of the Friends Board or Christine Bada, our administrative assistant working with the Friends, if you'd like to make a contribution today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne Williford for our very brief business meeting that we always do right before our annual meeting program. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. The first thing on the agenda says approval of minutes. However, due to a communication error, we don't have any printed minutes, but I will go quickly over what happened last year, and we will get those done at a later time in a printed form. But the annual meeting was held on June 19, 2017. Susie H. Hamilton, the Secretary of Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, welcomed the group. Following approval of the minutes, Sarah Kuntz offered a Secretary Treasurer's report, followed by a President's report and the election of board members. And the program was presented by Jackson Marshall, who spoke on North Carolina and World War II. After his talk here, we adjourned, and those who were interested went over and toured the very excellent museum exhibit on World War I, at the Museum of History. So those are briefly the minutes from last year. My President's report is also going to be very brief. I just want to mention that our balance is $216,811.03. We recently did put some money in some high-yielding CDs, which are doing very well right now, and we're pleased with that turnout. We want to mention that our membership is currently 108 members, and we have 148 life members. So we're always interested in bringing other people into the Friends, so if you know people who may be interested, please talk to them about the group, and there are handouts that Christine Bada will be happy to provide to you to give out to any who may be interested. We want to elect our officers for next year. I want to mention that those who are going off of the board, Ann Flint, Larry Odzak, and Dick Langford, and we want to thank them for their service. We certainly have appreciated it. If you'll give them a round of applause. Our candidates for the coming year are George Thomas, who is a genealogist, Frank King, who also does a lot of genealogy, and Joe Mobley, who for many years was an employee of the Office of Archives and History and knows very well the workings of the archives. And then Jason Tomberlin is eligible to come back on for another term. So those are our nominees. Are there any nominees from the floor? Do we have a motion to accept these nominees? Okay, is there a second? Second. All right, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. All right, so those are our new board members for the coming year. Our officers will actually stay the same. I will serve as president, Karen Parr will be vice president, and Dick will remain as past president. I guess we need to approve that slate as well. Do we have a nomination to approve those? Second? Second. All right. All in favor say aye. Aye. Okay. Any opposed? All right. So that will be our slate for the coming year. And we do want to recognize our volunteers. This year, we had 32 volunteers who have given over 4,500 hours to the work of the archives, and we very much appreciate those. So I'm going to let Sarah come up. If any of the volunteers are here, we want to give them their certificate.
All right, if we have volunteers here, if you would come down front when your name is called, we'll take a picture at the end for anybody that's here. Now, and keep in mind that some of these are from our regional facilities, the Western Regional Archives and Outer Banks History Center, so they might not be in attendance today. Okay. Are they in this order too?
I don't know.
Okay. All right.
If they're here.
And for those of you that may not have seen it, on the table as you come in the auditorium, there's a 2-page handout that specifies what projects each of these volunteers worked on. So that's a great way to see specifically how they were contributing to our work. Andrew Poole, John Teal, Carl Larson. They can come out up here. Rachel McManaman, Stephen Lord, Catherine Walls, Ashley Ashabranner, Cameron Bellow, Catherine Crawford, Neil Graves, sorry, got your own name. Ashley. I was going too fast. I know it's in here, I just saw it.
There it is.
Okay. Carol Gutman. Pierce Hall. Robert Kaplan. Francis Keller, Bonnie Krause, Philip Lane, Sher Liu, Scarlett Lowry, Will Morgan, Lisa Paesi, Sandy Reed, Isaac Ravia, Kira Robertson, Amber South, Lawana South, Kristen Walden, Brandon Widner, Joy Farrell, Gilliam Mahoney, Bernie Carasina, Marilyn Carasina, David Haas, Donna Haas, Chandler Foster. I thought I saw him. Okay, there you go. So as I said, do take a moment to look at the list of what all they have contributed. It's a pretty impressive list of collections worked and other projects completed and oral history summarized, and we do appreciate all the work of our volunteers, and a lot of these are at our regional facilities, so we will be sure that they get their certificates. But join me in giving our volunteers a round of applause. Okay.
We're gonna have to be over here so we
Okay.
don't have the screen in our face.
The giant otter. The giant
Yeah,
otter.
exactly.
Can we get in the picture or not?
Yeah, go ahead, Joanne. Yeah,
Splits in front, Joanne.
let's, good. Hold your certificates up high, big smiles. You look great. One more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Is there any other business that needs to come before the group today? Anybody have anything else to bring up? Okay, then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Joanne. Okay, well, at the State Archives, I think we are used to thinking about our treasures as the rare and celebrated pieces of our documentary heritage, often kind of flat, one-dimensional things like the Bill of Rights or the Charter. But today we have a real treat because we have the opportunity to experience another North Carolina treasure, author, historian, and storyteller David Cecelski. Educated at Duke and Harvard, Dr. Cecelski has held distinguished visiting professorships at Duke, UNC Chapel Hill, and ECU. Some of his books include The Fire of Freedom, Abraham Galloway and the Slave Civil War, The Waterman's Song, Slavery and Freedom in Maritime North Carolina, and A Historian's Coast, Adventures into the Tidewater Past. I do recommend that you go to his website. There you're going to find a lot of essays, stories, and lectures, including those from his Listening to History series that you may remember from the News and Observer that ran between 1998 and 2008. And I have to say, who in this room would not love a series on the website called Love in the Archives? In that section of his website, you'll find stories of his expeditions to museums, libraries, and archives. Dr. Cecelski was raised on the North Carolina coast, and his writing focuses passionately on telling stories from his little corner of the world that illuminate America's history more broadly. Today, we look forward to hearing more about the photography of Charles Farrell. Please join me in welcoming David Cecelski.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Sarah. It's so nice to be here. Half of you here have been helping me do history for way longer than I'd like to think. Kim Anderson has been a big help forever, but she's been especially essential to the project I'm going to talk about today. Chris and I have done work together for ages. So if I haven't thanked you all enough over the years, thank you. I am a George Stevenson taught me more about doing history than anybody in graduate school and anybody in and everyone in all the history departments I've ever been in put together. Sarah probably doesn't know it, but because of that, the State Archives and the Friends of the State Archives is kind of in the category of always say yes. Go anywhere, talk to anybody, do anything. Mr. Stevenson and I think even until the end of his life, think he still called me professor or doctor, and I'm sure I still called him Mr. Stevenson. But he taught me not only about the craft of doing history and a certain attitude, a certain disposition, a certain kind of focused curiosity to approaching history, but on long walks and lunches and upstairs in that horrible office of his that was piled with books that y'all are probably still excavating. He also just taught me a lot sort of about how the human heart works, which then guides the way that you look at historical questions. So it's great to be here in his world again. Today, I'm going to talk about a project. Can I tell you how I got into it? It was to avoid. This is me and my otter friend, by the way. Don't judge us. I think I was giving a talk at the Blessing of the Fleet, where the fishermen at Hatteras Island, the fleet's blessed once a year. And I think that's Sammy. He's a Coast Guard mascot. But I have a group of, I still spend half my time at the home place where I grew up on the coast. On those nights, I sleep in the bedroom where my mother was born, where my grandfather was born, where my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather were born. So I'm very attached to it. And there's a crowd of old fishermen that on Thursday afternoons gets together and tells stories, some of which are true. And when I'm in the neighborhood, I stop by, and they like to find ways to humiliate the guy with the PhD. So they like to bring in things. They like to bring in artifacts, objects that were so common when they were young. Most of these guys are almost 90 now. That they're like really ordinary things, and they're hoping that I won't know what they are. A couple of years ago, they brought in this black object, cylindrical with a hole through it, and they call me professor. You know, professor, I bet you don't know what this is. And I guess right, it was a guess, that it was a float, the kind that supported fishing nets, like a buoy thing, except it was nothing like I had ever seen before. So then they said, well, how did they make it? And they said, and you have no idea how much time in a year we spent doing this, and our fathers and grandfathers. And it turned out the object was, in those days before there were factory-made floats for fishing nets, to hold the fishing net up on the surface of the water, they had, they would go when the fishing season was done, early winter, first week of December or so, they'd go off into the marsh, into the swamps for weeks and dig out the roots of black gum trees, chop them out, dry them out, put hot prods through them, make the tar themselves, out of longleaf pine, and then coat them with tar. And this was something that in the, for the variety of nets that they use, this would take, thousands of floats in the course of a year, and was basically used up most of the free time they had in the winter. Which also then led to this broad discussion of all the other ways that what I had considered downtime in the winter, like this one break they had all year, all the things that they were doing in the winter that it turned out it wasn't much of a downtime at all. Women staying up till midnight after everyone else is asleep, knitting the nets for those and all kinds of things. So after repeated humiliations by, they call themselves the Liars Club, or maybe that's just me, Chris, that I call them that. I was looking for a project that would allow me to go into, sort of provide a window to understand better the material culture, the material world of coastal life prior to what I'll roughly call the modern age, prior to the Second World War. All of which I was supposed to be sort of an expert on already, but I think these men had convinced me that I had a lot to learn. So, Kim introduced me to the Charles A. Farrell collection here. It's a group of historical photographs that this photographer, Charles Farrell, made between 1937 and 1941 in coastal villages all over North Carolina, all over the North Carolina coast. And let me show you why I like him. I'm going to run through real quick a number of his pictures, and then I'm going to focus on a small group of them. This is Southport in about 1937, on the Southport waterfront. This is Elias Nehi, Gore. He's a Menhaden fisherman, same time period. He was believed to be the largest man in the world, by the way. Ripley's believed. He was, people argue whether he was 7'10" or a little bit taller, and he fills it out, you know. I visited with his family, and everyone remembers him as a very gentle man. That's Nehi on the end, on the left. This is in the cabin room of one of the Menhaden boats off Southport. Charles Farrell, unlike a lot of coastal photographers, took pictures of everybody. African Americans. This is not just fishermen, but these are people peeling shrimp in Southport, same time period. At that time, Southport was the largest shrimp port by tonnage in the world. Hurricane Hazel ended that in 1954, but this was big business. I don't remember his name. I know that he's a shrimp boat builder, a shrimp trawler builder in Southport. These women work at a herring cannery on the Chewan River. This is under the main bridge in Edenton. Salting fish. Nobody took pictures of salting fish. All these kind of basic, ordinary parts of daily life, Farrell had this sort of eye for. He wasn't just looking for kind of the glamorous or romantic view of the coast. He took lots of pictures of women. This is a herring, they're cleaning herring and canning herring on the Chewan River. These are Menhaden fishermen near where I grew up in Beaufort, off the coast of Beaufort. Everyone in this picture would be African American. Back to the Chewan River. I just like this picture. This is One Cheese, I think, somewhere on Roanoke Island. This is Hatteras Island, and some of you may recognize this. That's the state boat. They call it a shad boat. And amongst people that are historians of traditional boats, this boat is North Carolina's contribution to American boat building. There's no boat like it. Anywhere. It has features, including that triangular sail up there at the top, but also in its construction that are unlike any boat ever made. And it was first built along the Alligator River and Roanoke Island in the 1870s and 80s. By this point, they're just going out for a Sunday sail. Nobody commercial fished. By 1937, 38, when these pictures were taken, nobody was commercial fishing with a sailboat. That was over for 20 years earlier. That's the interior of a shad boat. This is man's Harbour. He's in a shad boat too. That's also Roanoke Island. I believe this is Nag's Head, somewhere on, and you can barely tell that his garden is surrounded by discarded fishing nets. He took lots of pictures of children. This is a capstan, which two of these would haul in the end of a net. This is on the Roanoke River, just 2 or 3 miles from Plymouth. And those gentlemen are African American. This is a small one, a small capstan. This is for hauling in herring, shad, rockfish in the late winter, early spring. On Albemarle Sound, the capstan, which is the device that brings in the rope, would be so large they would have used oxen or horses or mules to haul in the nets. On Albemarle Sound, they were hauling in nets with 100,000 fish at a time. Here, it's a few hundred or thousand at a time. Oops. I believe that's a duck. He's a shad boat builder. He does the engine work in Manteo. He looks like an oysterman to me, and he's that's right in front of Edenton. This is kind of an unusual picture. This is the New River. Let's see, we're on the Sneed Ferry side, a place called Fulford's Landing. They're carrying bags of flour. They've just, in that era, late 30s, Sneed's Ferry didn't have its own grist mill. Barely see the white on the other side are houses on the other, houses and stores in the community that's called Marines in Onslow County. And right Camp Lejeune took all of that land and moved all those people. So they've just come back. The gentleman on the left, your left, I've become friends with his daughter. She's 93 years old, and she writes a poem and puts it on Facebook every morning and tells stories. I know. What's not to like, right? This is also up on the Chewan River. This is near Rocky Hawk. She doesn't look like she wants her picture taken. One of the funny things about looking for the stories behind these photographs, and I guess I should say that despite Kim's best and most diligent efforts, we don't know there's not a lot of written records about the photographs, like the names of the individuals or sometimes even the places. So that's been part of the issue, is figuring that out. And in this case, I was showing the photograph to people on the Outer Banks, just trying to locate who this might be. And someone said, well, he looks like a Daniels. You should ask in Man's Harbour. So I found out who were the oldest people in Man's Harbour, and sure enough, he was a Daniels from Man's Harbour. This is a young man also in Man's Harbour. Again, the kind of picture that I just don't see anywhere else. It's not a very good picture like this, but he's in the family smokehouse. It's a combination of smoked fish, muskrats, and other critters. This is Lizzie. Lizzie Beasley, and she's on Collington Island. That's her daughter, Callie. That's her husband, Felix. Lizzie grew up on Nag's Head, born around, I think, 1922. She was famous for kind of an insouciant air. That's her father. He's a fisherman. All four of his sons were fishermen, and then his daughter married a fisherman. He was one of the 5 witnesses to the Wright brothers' first flight. I just love that he takes pictures of kids. But he also, I took these pictures. This is also on Collington Island, which is on Body Island. I took these pictures to Collington. By the time I got back, they had made their own Facebook page just of the pictures, and so word about what was in them and the people in them and what they were doing in them was coming from all over the United States at that point. And it's just a small thing, but it's one I like because I think it's very typical of fishing communities. I asked on their Facebook page, what are those things they're carrying? And it turned out that one's a gill net weight, and the other's also a piece of fishing gear. And it was actually a very specific game, hook and arrow or something that the kids all over the island played. But kind of repurposing Dad's fishing gear into forts and toys and everything else. It's kind of this very, but you don't see that much except in Farrell's pictures. That's Felix again, and Lizzie, Callie, and I'm blanking on the young man's name, Ivy, in Collington. That's the Menhaden plant near where I grew up, down East Carteret County. Menhaden fishermen in Beaufort. Menhaden fishing, those are all fish in the middle. Same thing. They've joined the fish now, so they're so tight that over here is a larger vessel where that giant kind of spoon thing comes out of and hauls the fish out. That's my daughter. That's on Shackleford Banks, one of the barrier islands. So before we start the series I'm going to focus on today, let me tell you a little bit about how I've approached the research for these. I need to wander. I've tried to do 4 different things. One's obvious. I've pursued the sort of documentary records that you have here at the State Archives. There's not a tremendous amount for most of these photographs, but there are some. The Outer Banks History Center had a oral history with one of the gentlemen that was done in the 1980s. The Southern in Chapel Hill had WPA interviews that were useful to me. Lots of old newspapers. The second thing I did was take the photographs back to the communities from where they came. So as soon as I could figure out where a photograph was taken, which often took some time, I would take it back to that area, Sneed's Ferry or Southport or the Chewan River, wherever. and try to flesh out the story behind those photographs and find people that could look at it and see not just like who these people are, but tell me about their lives and tell me, what's in those barrels? What are those trays over there for? Why do you have a hog out there? These two boats are, I won't go into it unless you want me to, but these two boats are constructed very differently. Two entirely different boat building traditions. Why? So I took those back, and a lot of those, as I did I usually started in people's homes, but by the end we had gatherings, almost sort of homecoming style, at churches and community centers, one or two museums. I showed up at the State Credit Union in Manteo. I hated to go there because I don't want to I had a lead to an individual, and I didn't want to bother her at work, but it was the only contact I could get. So she was working as a teller there, the person I was looking for, and I had my computer. I opened the laptop. She burst out crying. The family had no photographs of her grandmother. I had 7 or 8. Lizzie, that we saw, was her grandmother. We had the whole credit union there. Everyone was looking and adding. So then, so this was sort of typical. So they invite me over that afternoon to the house. By the time I get there, there's 40 or 50 people, all with strong opinions about these photographs. Oh, they were ear biters. Collington Island, they all agreed were ear biters. And like with Collington, I eventually, through that experience, I sort of found a guide. There was a young, my age, commercial fisherman. I hang out a lot with some really old people. And we would go house to house. We would visit cousins, and they would put things on Facebook, and we would gather information, and then we sometimes if a family reunion or something was coming up, they would just have me come show the pictures. Other times they would arrange some kind of special event. And so I could ask my questions. The third thing I did was that for some of the things I wanted to learn about, there was nobody left in the communities where the pictures were taken who could tell me about them. So this picture is a good example. The pictures I'm going to talk about briefly today, they're doing a kind of fishing that nobody in his community, there's only one crew left in the whole state that does it. Well, 2 crews. They're both from Salter Path out on Bogue Banks, Atlantic Beach, Emerald Isle area. They are rough, rowdy. They do a kind of fishing that the fishing piers don't like, that tourists often object to they get in their way. The police don't like it because they take up a lot of room and make a lot of noise. So every time they get a complaint, they make sure that's where they go first the next year. And so I spent a couple days with those guys from Salter Path while they were fishing, and then at night we would just turn on the tape recorder, audio recorder. They inherited a language and a way of looking at the fishery that is only theirs now. So even though I got to know his grandsons, and even though we had an event in their church, and we had an event at a local museum, none of those people understand that language anymore. The guys on Salter Pass still do. they can look at this and it's like they're reading like a chapter of a book. They dated it, and this is true, without me telling them, they dated this year and month. Yeah, and how the fishing was, and where the wind was. You know? So in some cases, if I couldn't find anyone left, that's what I would do. The fourth thing I did was that I reached out to some material culture experts, people that know a lot more about some things than I do. Mike Alfred, who was the original traditional wooden boat specialist at the Maritime Museum, he's been retired for 20 years now. He has been just indispensable. He's the foremost authority on North Carolina traditional wooden boats in the world. Probably one of the 2 or 3 most important authorities in the American South. But I had some strange ones. Larry Babits, who used to be the head of the Maritime History program at ECU. Larry is a clothes guy. He does historical reenactment, focuses mostly on the Revolutionary War. He's the kind of guy that raises his own sheep, makes his own wool, and sews the appropriate clothes for his. Chris is like, yes. This one and 10 or 12 more that I'm going to share with you. And he sent me and I asked him just to look at the clothes. And he sent me a 9-page, single-spaced memo on the clothes. Very little of which I'm going to share with you. But it was, so for all those things, for Paula Johnson at the Smithsonian looked at the fishing gear with me. So that's what I'm trying to bring to learn how to see these better and to understand their relationship to the sea and how that's changed by looking closely, sort of finding that discovering their world through these sorts of grains of sand. So let me start with these pictures. You with me so far? Let's see if I can find my glasses. Charles Farrell, I should say, was a photographer from Greensboro. His father was a itinerant tintype photographer, born in Chatham County. In 1895, he settled and started a shop in Winston-Salem. Then his son, Charles, who took these pictures, started the first photography shop in Greensboro. In addition, he was the Greensboro News and Records first professional photographer. Farrell's family had close ties to the coast from his father's itinerant days. And Charles Farrell came down a lot and was supposed to be doing a book for UNC Press between 1937 and 1941. And the photographs in the collection upstairs were supposed to be part of that. He had health problems. He had mental health problems, and it's sad to say, but he had one of those what people used to call ice pick lobotomies. So his creative life ended around 1943 or 44. He lived much longer, but his creative life was kind of the end of that. This is Brown's. These pictures were taken in 2 batches, one in 1937 and one in 1940. And the pictures were all taken. This is what Mullet Camp. People know what jumping mullet are? Yes? Sort of? Fish. Fish. You look dubious. In the orange, you look dubious. Pink? Is that pink? There are great schooling fish in the fall of the year. For those of us that grew up down there, I'm sure half the people would say that jumping mullet's our favorite fish to eat. For much of the 19th century and early 20th century, North Carolina had the largest mullet fishery in the United States, and it was the largest fishery of any kind in the American South. And the fish were all salted, what wasn't eaten locally, were all salted and sent all over the country. All of the people in these photographs came from, Browns Island was deserted. Nobody lived there. It's roughly between Swansboro and Jacksonville-ish. Swansboro and Sneads Ferry. Next to Hammocks Beach State Park, if any of you know Hammocks Beach, Bear Island. It's still uninhabited. Every fall, the men would move from their community, which is in Carteret County. These are two families, the Lawrences and the Gilligans, who were all from Otway, North Carolina, in Carteret County. And they would make the trip to this island and spend 2.5 or 3 months there every fall. The ocean is behind the dunes. On the other side, the gentleman walking down the dock is Bedford Lawrence. He's the sound waters would be here. Those are the tables where you would salt the fish, put them into barrels. The goat, the cat, and the hogs are cleaning up from probably last night's catch. In the distance, you can see a couple of the camp buildings. This over here is the shed where they stored the barrels until they were picked up and carried off. This is a view of maybe half the Mullet Camp. Now we're standing on the ocean dunes looking toward the sound. These are the place. These buildings are where the men lived and cooked. There's the shed where the salted fish barrels are kept. Behind that is the sound. You can see a line of water that runs along the back there. That's the intercoastal waterway, what they called the Big Ditch, that was dug in the 19-teens. And then that's the mainland of Onslow County on the other side. This is Bedford Lawrence. And I'm going to read one or two little things. I'm going to read about Bedford. So this is Bedford Lawrence on the ocean beach at Browns Island. You can see he's wearing a faded denim jacket, a gabardine or denim shirt, and an oilcloth or rubberized canvas sou'wester. You can tell he may have waterproofed the hat with linseed or cottonseed oil. In one hand, he holds a net needle, a little device for repairing fishing nets. In the other, his pipe, which you can bet was filled with RJR tobacco that his grandchildren told me was his favorite brand. From the look of the surf, a good blow is coming on, judging from the look of it from the northeast. Then 70 years old, Bedford Lawrence had been mullet fishing at Browns Island every fall since the 1880s. Like all the fishermen, he came from Otway, a remote community on the salt marshes of Ward's Creek, which is a 2-day trip by boat from Browns Island. At home, he worshiped at the New River Primitive Baptist Church, played fiddle at community square dances, and was head of a large family. Like all the fishermen, he was not a wealthy man. He and his wife Emma, 5 children, and other relatives all lived in a 2-room house that didn't look much different than the cabins at Browns Island, at least in the memory of his descendants. No wonder he enjoyed the island's peace and quiet. He was what people down there call a saltwater farmer. He made his living partly on the water and partly on the farm. And that was true of most Otway residents and was also typical of mullet fishermen throughout the North Carolina coast. Otway was located on salt marshes, but mullet fishermen at many other camps traveled from farming communities far from the sea, and except for mullet fishing, kept to their farms. Bedford Lawrence lived at the Browns Island camp, beginning with what people call the mullet blow. Still call it that. It's a gale, usually in late August or early September, that announces the shift of the prevailing winds from the northeast to the northeast and the arrival of the jumping mullet. He stayed at Browns Island all fall and came home just before Christmas. The rest of the year, he divided his time between fishing, clamming, and oystering closer to home, and he also tended 5 acres of field and garden. He grew 2 acres of sweet potatoes, an acre of, what they used to call Irish potatoes, and feed crops for his cows, horses, and hogs. Bedford Lawrence's grandson, a dredge boatman named H.B. Lawrence, told me that his granddaddy didn't mind getting away from Otway during the sweet potato harvest. Digging and banking sweet potatoes, banking involves covering them with salt marsh and straw in order to preserve them through the winter. That was hard work, but so was mullet fishing, and he could leave the harvest in the hands of his wife and children at home. This is a quote, "I have been told that Bedford probably made between $1,000 and $1,200 a year between farming and fishing," his grandson said. "We didn't have a lot of money, but we always had plenty to eat, and we never went hungry." Every autumn, Bedford Lawrence returned to the islet for the mullet fishing, along with other members of the Lawrence and Gilligan clans. In his younger days, he was captain of the Browns Island crew. By the 1930s, however, he was the Mullet Camp's lookout. No job was more essential to a mullet fishery's success. The fish moved down the beach from the north in great schools and a keen practiced eye, as H.B. Lawrence told me, and I quote, could see the difference in the color of the water. His granddaddy, he recalled, and I quote, had an eye for mullet. He waited for the fish from a post roughly half a mile north of the camp. When he spied a school of mullet, he'd give a shout and raise a flag. Usually it was just like a wax myrtle or a yopon branch, which spurred a frantic rush of his comrades to their boat and into the waves. On a recent tour of his grandfather's neighborhood in Otway, H.B. Lawrence wanted me to know that his grandfather was no stranger to sorrow. By the time of this photograph, he and Emma had already lost 2 children, one, Bedford Tilden, in a shooting accident in 1920, and the other, their daughter Dorothy, in childbirth in 1926. Emma Lawrence never recovered from their deaths and was bedridden for the last decades of her life. They loved the Lord and they loved their neighbor, H.B. told me. They were great-grandparents who loved each other and their family. This is Leonard Gilligan. He was the head of the camp, and in the background you can see 3 of their hogs. They're on the fishing beach. As Larry Babits pointed out, he's wearing a CCC coat, Civilian Conservation Corps. And I may have teased Larry a little bit about some of the details of his 10-page memo on the men's clothing. But that tells us something, is that if he's the head of the Mullet gang, and he's a CCC road worker, which the census confirmed, it tells you that rough times, nobody here is rich. One of the strange things, he's so kind of debonair, here in 1937, one of the strange things about showing these photographs to family members of these men is that, and members of their community, is that you learn what happened to them the rest of their life. See them in this instant, but in Carteret County with these guys, the rest of their life comes into. And in this case, I met the man who, when he was 6 years old, walked into Leonard Gilligan's house and found him killed. He committed suicide. He shot himself because he had cancer, which I find quite often in that period, that at a certain point, not having the medical advances we have now, people put themselves out of misery. But that was some years after this. That would have been 25 years after this. This is Buck Gilligan. He's the cook. This camp operated basically like an old-fashioned sailing ship at sea, and the cook, his primary job was to feed people and feed them well. He's going to fry corned spot here. They ate mostly spot. The mullet were too valuable, which is hard to believe. It's a poor person's food. But when the water was too rough, or the fish weren't running on the ocean side, they could always catch a fish that we called spot, little small, yummy, sweet fish, on the sound side. And there was no market for it. There was no place they could sell it, so they would eat that themselves. So that's what Buck Gilligan is doing. If when they needed him at the fishing beach, he would drop everything, and he would help haul in the nets. They ate a lot of fish, a lot of flour biscuits, and blackstrap molasses. This is the only other passage I think I want to read. This is a group of the younger fishermen at the camp. And you can see a pair of heavy ash push poles for a boat that are leaning up against the tar paper and slat roof on one of the camp's cabins. On the far left, the young man in bib overalls, behind the young man in bib overalls and a pith helmet, you can see a line of cork floats dangling from a nail. A cooking pan hangs on the wall behind him, and a wash basin sits on a shelf next to the cabin door. The two men standing to the right of him over here are wearing CCC shirts, regulation shirts, so they also worked for this, probably for road crews, building roads when it wasn't fishing season. On the far right, you can see laundry drying on a line behind the fellow in the captain's hat. Charles Farrell, our photographer, did not identify any of these young fishermen by name. However, descendants of the Gilligans and Lawrences who fished at Browns Island, when we gathered a little while ago at a community supper at Harker's Island, they inspected the photographs with me, and they identified two of the fishermen in this photograph with some certainty. The young man second from the left as M.T. Gilligan, and the one on the far right is James Lawrence, who died a few years later in the Second World War. The younger generation of Gilligans and Lawrences continued a long tradition of mullet fishing at Browns Island. Charles Farrell noted that the Gilligans in particular had fished for mullet and spot on the island, quote, from time immemorial. In earlier days, the fishermen lived in round huts that they built with conical roofs and thatched with salt marsh rushes. But in most other ways, the operation of the mullet fishery had changed little over the years. And of course, there would have been, each mullet fishery had its own territory. An island like Bogue Banks would have had 12 or 14 camps on it. There would have been no empty beaches. Topsail Island, Core Banks, all the way up to about Ocracoke in the first part of Hatteras. A great legend, this is a quote, a great legend has grown up around these people, Farrell noted on the back of this photograph's original print. He wrote that the great-great-grandfather of these young Gilligans was, and I quote, the Paul Bunyan of the Carolina fisher folk, which means Farrell could only have been referring to Decatur Gilligan, who's a mythic figure in the down east part of Carteret County. And if you believe the stories about him, he could row a boat faster, lift nets heavier, and catch more fish, as well as do a variety of other things that aren't mentionable in public space, than any man alive before or since. Under certain conditions, people still tell stories about Decatur Gilligan. They still make up stories about Decatur Gilligan. This is an interior view of one of the mullet camps. This gentleman is Bryant Gilligan. I think he's the number 2 man in the camp, and I think he's the oldest man in the camp. I don't know who this is. I like that there's a box of lard. Charles Farrell's photographs must have 100 pictures of lard in them. It's kind of a unifying theme. You can bet that the mattresses were stuffed with seaweed. And to tell you how geeky I'm being with this project, I figured out what kind of seaweed that I found a group of elderly men that were willing to go out to the shore with me and describe the kind of seaweeds that their fathers would collect for mattresses. And it was a very particular kind. It's like everybody was like, "Oh no, you can't do sargassum. Those little round balls are very uncomfortable." And if they're lucky, the pillows will be stuffed. If they were like most coastal pillows in those times, with wild bird feathers, goose or wild bird feathers. Bryant Gilligan was listed as an oysterman in the 1900 federal census of Otway, and then as a farmer in the 1920 census. Just like Bedford Lawrence, he was kind of one of these saltwater farmers that did a little bit of both. And he was also a lay preacher, who at least as an exhorter. On the back of another photograph of Bryant, Mr. Bryant, Charles Farrell wrote, Captain Bryant Gilligan allows that he will spend the winter on the banks, meaning Brown's Island, seeing that he has no responsibilities and likes the peace of the place. This is an etching, 1880 etching from Shackelford Banks, which shows a mullet camp of the old kind. And that's about typical crew in those days, half black, half white for Shackelford. That's Mr. Gilligan again. I just like that Farrell takes pictures of old men shaving, We do a lot of that. Here he is again, sitting by the mullet boat. Those posts with the crossbars on them are net spreads. Every day after they fished, particularly when they're using cotton nets, they would have to lime the nets down and then spread them over the net spreads. The net spreads usually had to be brought from home. They're usually made out of ash. The nets in 1937, you can't tell for sure if they're cotton. If they're cotton, it's kind of right at the cusp. Prior to that period, mostly women would have made all the nets by hand. In this era in the mullet fishery, the very first factory-made nets are starting to come in. This is the classic kind of mullet boat. You can't tell it yet, but it's double-ended. It's sharp on both ends. It's 24, 25 feet long. Mike Alfred, who I told you about at the Maritime Museum, looked at the construction and see how the boards sort of are uneven down at the base, kind of just inside his knee. He took that as a sign that it wasn't made in a professional boat building shop. The same kind of boat was very popular, basically kind of factory production in New England. He assumes that means that it was built local, probably Hatteras Island, probably about 1935. Mike said it was that it's just as good, just as functional. This same kind of boat is the kind that was used in the 18th century in North Carolina to carry pilots out to vessels coming in our inlets. It's the same kind of boat that's used in the bottlenose dolphin fishery that Ann featured in my article 2 or 3 years ago. It's good for crashing through surf. Whalers used it on Shackleford Banks and out at Cape Lookout, and the Coast Guard used them. And here, Charles Farrell was out there on a Sunday, and these guys weren't mullet fishing, but they're just showing how they did it. So in this case, they're showing Charles Farrell how they would bring their boat back into the water. See, they have these heavy crossbars, and the way they would actually do the fishing is you would turn this picture around, and when the lookout yells, when Mr. Bryant Gilligan yells, "Boat, boat, boat," from his post a half mile up the beach, they would all pour out of the cabins or whatever else they're doing, get in this boat, carry it like this with the net in the stern, back into the water with one man standing on shore with a staff. They called it a sud staff. And that man would plant that staff next to in the ocean surf where it's shallow, and stand there and hold it while they lay out the net behind them as they move out into the water. The fish are moving this way down the beach, and they would do sort of a giant, sort of a U around the fish, and come all the way around, and then come back ashore and plant a second sud staff. Everybody then gets out of the boats. The cook comes out of his cabin. Everyone hits the shore, and they haul the net ashore by hand at that point. It's hard to describe the numbers of fish. My grandmother used to remember being able to see the schools of mullet from miles away. There's still a lot of mullet, but probably not like that. And they have a pooch. They call that whole operation striking mullet, by the way. These are two brothers. We're almost done here. Carol Lawrence and Lloyd Lawrence. And they are salting spot. These are those tables that we saw from looking back the other way. Salt mullet particularly was ubiquitous. Every pantry in the coast would have had a barrel of salt mullet. If you went to a country store anywhere east of 95, every country store would have had a barrel of salt mullet. West of I-95, it was salt mackerel from New England, of all places, by this time. It came by the railroad. Just tens and tens of thousands of barrels. When I was growing up, they still called Atlantic and Coastline Railroad down to Morehead City, the old Mullet line. You know, it was like, that's the shed where they store the mullet. That's the sound. Anybody know what this is? This is Mullet Row, and there were some years. So it's fish eggs, the sack of fish eggs, and as you'll see in a minute, they're kind of yellow, or I like them best when they're kind of sunset orange, and they would remove the eggs from the fish, and then salt them heavily, rinse off the salt. And sun dry them for 4 or 5 days if you have good, nice sunny weather, and then they would last. I have some in my fridge that are a year old. I try to eat them sooner, and there were some years, depending what the markets were, when the mullet roe was more valuable than the fish. Particularly immigrants, Italian immigrants in places like New York City and southern New England, Slavic immigrants from in places like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and such. They came from a tradition where not just roe, but mullet roe was a delicacy. This is also mullet roe, the way it would be hung up. Bedford Lawrence always, his grandson told me he always came home with a couple barrels of it. When I was growing up, old fishermen would keep it in their, it doesn't have to be refrigerated. I refrigerate mine so it lasts a long time, but it doesn't have to be refrigerated for weeks, months maybe. And so old fishermen, when I was growing up, would carry it around in their pockets and eat it like beef jerky for their lunches. Oops. And that was my mullet roe a few years ago, and I still do it the same way. If you go to fancy Italian restaurants, potage is that, and they grate it onto pasta. I know, and it's yummy. Okay. This is our second to last picture. This is Elizabeth Turner, later Elizabeth Turner Taylor. And she would come out and visit the camp on Sundays. And for a long time, well, this picture is interesting to me for 2 reasons. First, do you see those things hanging up on the cabin? I was only looking at small versions of the picture, and I was at a gathering where on Hatteras Island, where there were a lot of commercial fishermen in the crowd, and I thought they looked kind of like they were hanging up their socks or something. And that caused one of the biggest rounds of laughter at my expense that I've ever had. Those are salt spot, a kind of fish. And it's another reason I love Charles Farrell's pictures. This would have been a ubiquitous scene on the North Carolina coast before the era of refrigeration and ice boxes. Every home on the coast would have had an empty room where they would lay out the fish and let them dry on a bench in an empty room, or they would hang them from clotheslines, or they would put them on their roof over the porch, or they'd put them in their front yards. Fish are very unreliable, and if you are people that depend on fish, you cannot count on fresh fish running. So you salt them, and it is the staple food for coastal North Carolina from the early 1700s for many people into the 1930s. I'm sure there are other photographs. I'm sure Kim, if she looked hard enough, could find. but I've looked at a lot, and I've never seen another picture. It was one of these things that it's like so ordinary. You know, it's like such an ordinary part of life to them that I think nobody ever bothered. Like, why would you take a picture of that? Who takes pictures of themselves doing laundry, you know, or mopping the floor? But this would have been a really big thing. And in this case, there's two different ways to salt fish. And Buck, who we met earlier, Buck Gilligan, salted these real lightly, and then and then hung them up to dry in the sun. And they're probably gonna eat these tonight or tomorrow. The other way to salt the fish is much more icky. Not icky. It's inundate it with much more salt so that it lasts a long, long time. But it loses some of the taste. This is Elizabeth Turner, and for a long time, I couldn't find out who she was. But everybody who saw these pictures, we even did a photo exhibit of them at UNC and then later at the museum on Hatteras Island. And everyone always wanted, people started calling her Mickey Mouse Girl because she has a little Mickey Mouse there on her blouse. And it's just kind of, I think people thought it was kind of incongruous that she was out at this men's, you know, very male world. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I was at the annual homecoming dinner. There's a homecoming for the people who were evicted from the land that became Camp Lejeune. You know, when they built Camp Lejeune, 1941, 1942, they moved 1,800 people, I guess, roughly. And some of those people, there's not many left, but lots of their children and grandchildren come and they go back to Camp Lejeune and have the reunion. And I was having my chicken and dumplings and my collard greens and my light rolls next to a woman who was there with her mother. Her mother was very old. She was 99 years old. And it turned out it was her. And she was mostly deaf, and she was mostly blind, but she had an excellent memory. She remembered the day the pictures was taken. She described the photographer, and she described how she was there with her aunt. They lived on the sound side, and they would go down. Her aunt was a young widow with children. So she had gone to live with her aunt to help look after the children. They would go down to the shore, to the salt marsh, and wave a handkerchief. And she said, you wouldn't believe how quickly those men out at Brown's Island would come in and pick them up. And they would help haul in the nets, and they were always offered a full share of the fish. Every person who fished was given a share. She eventually married a Sneads Ferry fisherman named Wiley Taylor, who she told me she liked. She said he was a conniver, that when they courted, he would always want to go visit somebody. And they were always visiting by boat. Everybody got around by boat. He said that he always wanted to visit people who didn't have docks, because when somebody didn't have a dock, he would have to anchor his boat offshore and carry her. So that's Elizabeth Taylor. This is our last picture. These are the scavengers. And I even did research on what kind of breeds these were. This crowd carried a whole menagerie out there. They carried dogs to keep away the snakes. They carried hogs to eat the fish guts. They had cats for the mice and the rats. And they would all, at the end of the year, they would all load up and head back to their home in Carteret County. Some of the guys would try to barbecue the pigs, but they told me they learned quickly that a barbecue pig that tastes a lot like fish wasn't a great thing. So because they ate so many fish, so usually they would take them back to Otway and fatten them up on grain for a while, and then slaughter them. The hog's time on Brown's Island was not long after Charles Farrell visited, and neither was this tradition of mullet fishing. Didn't last long either on Brown's Island. Just a few, as I mentioned about that village on the mainland, a few months after Charles Farrell's second visit to the island, Camp Lejeune took the island, and ever since it's been part of Camp Lejeune. We call it the bombing range, and it's a good place not to visit. It's off limits to everybody because there's so much live ammunition, unexploded ordnance and such on the island. Those kinds of mullet camps continued maybe for another decade or so. Very few survived Hurricane Hazel in 1954 all over the coast. So people still mullet fish, but they do it in other ways, and they do it in such, they don't do sort of the camp thing, except for that wild crowd out on Salter Path. And they don't live in the camps. They live in their homes. So that's one little world from Charles Farrell's. He did this kind of photography in, I don't know, a dozen different, at least a dozen different places on the North Carolina coast. And to me, they're all just, little examples of the way the treasures, speaking of treasures, that the State Archives holds. Each of them, when looked at closely and held up to the light and explored deeply, opens up some part of our past in a way, it's sort of opening whole worlds. And it's a great thing you have, and it's an honor to be here today. Thank you. It affected other kinds of fisheries, but the national seashores and national parks would have been, even the earliest of them would have been 20 and 30 years later, would have been in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And by that time, this kind of fishing was long gone. Other kinds of fishing were still being conducted in those areas, and that is a source of great bitterness, or was a source of great bitterness at the time. That it was good, that they would restrict those kinds of fishing. Yeah.
Were there children in the camps, or did they come at
At the Browns Island camp, you'd start coming when you were 13 or 14. Some of the other camps were not all men, and were more, I was about to say family-oriented, but that's not exactly the connotation I want to give it. But they were families. So, for example, Salter Path by itself probably had 4 or 5 camps connected to it. And most of those people, the women came out to the camps and cooked every night, and children were in and out all the time, and that would have been true on much of the Outer Banks as well. People sometimes wonder why this island, these guys were a long way from their home. I mean, there are islands a lot closer to their home. And we don't know for sure, but every old mullet fisherman that I've discussed it with says that, well, that's because this is the best mullet fishing beach you could get anywhere. Southeast facing. Long story, but southeast facing is unusual, and because it's so old, so they claimed it. They probably claimed it in the mid or early 19th century. And once you claimed it, it's a little bit like anything else. It's kind of your territory, and you sometimes might have to fight for it. But so that's how they ended up so far from home. But most mullet camps would have been closer to a village or something. Jason. Yes, and the short answer here is I don't know where these guys got their salt. I know who they got it. They got it from a general store, the only general store in Otway, which at that general store at that time, you'd consider it sort of a bank, credit agency. The reason that general store fronted them the money that they could repair their nets and buy their barrels, and in exchange for the right to sell through them, which they would then make a relationship with the Fulton Fish Market in New York City, or one of the other major fish markets, almost always in New York City, sometimes Philadelphia and Baltimore. And I haven't been able to figure out where the salt came from. In the herring fisheries in the 19th century here, they got the extremely high quality salt from the Turks Islands in the Caribbean, where it was salt pans, ocean salt. Extremely expensive, extremely hard to get compared to other salts, but there was a trade back and forth between the coast and the Albemarle fisheries. I'm guessing that these people couldn't afford that kind of salt, and that if I had to guess, I'd say this was probably rock salt from someplace like Syracuse, New York, or someplace else like that. So it was mined salt instead of ocean salt. Good geeky question.
Thank you, David. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank y'all for coming.
And we will stand adjourned. Thank you all for being here.